At 4:11 in the morning, alarms went off across Texas. Military radar picked up a fast-moving boat cutting across the Rio Grande River. Cameras confirmed it, a 40-foot cartel vessel, painted dull gray, racing at almost 70 miles per hour. On deck, more than 40 armed men stood ready with assault rifles, heavy machine guns, and rocket launchers. Above them, drones circled at 1,500 feet, sending live video back across the border. This was no smuggling run. It was an organized landing force, moving straight into U.S. territory. Sirens blared across border posts. Marines scrambled into position. Coast Guard patrol boats roared forward. Floodlights swept the riverbank. In minutes, a quiet stretch of farmland turned into the front line. The cartel wasn't hiding. They marched in openly, as if daring America itself. Cartel dared to set foot on Texas soil. Was this not the clearest challenge to American military power? At 4:15 a.m., the first American response cut through the darkness. A Coast Guard Sentinel-class patrol boat, long and narrow like a blade, surged upriver at nearly 30 miles per hour. Its radar swept the surface of the Rio Grande, closing fast on the cartel vessel. The crew stood ready at their deck-mounted cannon, their helmets and night vision goggles catching glints of light. On the horizon, the cartel's gray gunboat was no longer a blur. It was coming straight toward them. The order was given to challenge the intruder. A loudspeaker blasted across the water in Spanish and English. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Stop your vessel immediately," but the response came not in words, but in fire. At 4:18, one of the cartel drones swooped lower, its buzzing like an angry hornet over the river. A Black Hawk helicopter patrolling above suddenly jolted as alarms screamed in its cockpit. The pilot shouted into the radio. Their aircraft had been locked, meaning an enemy tracker was targeting them. Sweat dripped into his eyes as he pulled the Black Hawk hard to the left, the helicopter shuddering as it banked. This was no random crossing. The cartel had come ready to fight. Seconds later, the night erupted. At 4:19, the first burst of machine gun fire tore across the river. Bright red tracers from a 12.7mm weapon slashed through the darkness, each round capable of punching through steel. Sparks flew as rounds struck the patrol boat's hull, ricocheting into the water. The crew ducked instinctively, the smell of hot metal filling the air. Then came the whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade. It streaked overhead and exploded against the levee, showering dirt and concrete. That was the moment hesitation vanished. At 4:22, two AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters roared into the fight. Their twin engines thundered low over the desert, rotor blades slicing the air. Each carried rocket pods and a 3-barrel cannon under the nose, weapons designed to chew up tanks and infantry alike. As they locked onto the cartel boat, the pilots squeezed their triggers. Dozens of Hydra rockets streaked down, slamming into the riverbank. Explosions lit the night in orange fireballs, shockwaves rolling across the water. Cartel fighters scattered, some diving flat to the deck, others leaping into the shallows for cover. On the ground, U.S. Marines were already in motion. Alerted minutes earlier, squads rushed from nearby border posts. They moved fast, setting up belt-fed M240 machine guns along the levee. The heavy guns barked, spitting streams of glowing rounds into the darkness. Each burst lit the sandbags stacked in front of them, shells clinking as they hit the ground. Behind them, Humvees rumbled into position, headlights cutting through clouds of dust, their mounted .50 caliber machine guns scanning for targets. For civilians living near the river, the sound was like nothing they had ever heard. The crack of gunfire, the ripping roar of helicopters, the thump of explosions. It was a war zone, and it was unfolding on American soil. But the cartel force pressed forward. They were not ordinary smugglers. Hidden spotters on the Mexican side relayed information by radio, guiding the attackers to American weak points. More drones buzzed overhead, dropping improvised explosives, crude, but enough to distract and disorient. Fighters on the boat fired in disciplined bursts, covering each other as they tried to establish a foothold on the bank. They moved not like gangs but like soldiers, using hand signals and coordinated maneuvers. The Coast Guard returned fire. Gunners swung their 25mm autocannon toward the cartel vessel and opened up. The recoil shook the deck as a storm of shells ripped into the boat's bow. Wood splintered, steel tore open, and men were thrown backward into the river. Water rushed through the holes, and the vessel listed heavily to one side. Still, some fighters clung on, spraying bullets wildly back across the water. By 4:26, the Marines had engaged fully. One squad advanced along the river road, rifles at the ready, as tracer fire from the cartel whizzed past their helmets. They fired back in controlled bursts, pushing the attackers toward the shoreline. Overhead, the Viper helicopters looped back in. One pilot squeezed the trigger on his chain gun, the 20mm cannon spitting shells at 600 rounds per minute. The gunfire chewed into the earth, tearing apart sandbag nests where cartel fighters had tried to dig in. But the cartel was not finished. At 4:29, another RPG whooshed out from the shadows, narrowly missing a Marine Humvee and exploding against a dirt embankment. Shrapnel rattled across armor plates, rattling the crew inside. At nearly the same time, a drone dropped a small, grenade-sized charge onto a Coast Guard cutter, detonating harmlessly on the deck, but proving the cartel's ingenuity. This was no half-hearted raid. It was an assault, carried out with coordination, drones, and heavy weapons. And though outgunned, the cartel had succeeded in turning the quiet river into a battlefield. By 4:30, the fight had escalated far beyond law enforcement. It was open combat. Gunfire echoed for miles. Helicopters strafed the banks. Patrol boats hammered targets with autocannons. And in Washington, live feeds streamed into the Situation Room. Officials watched in silence as red icons flashed across maps of the border. Every sign pointed to one conclusion: the United States was under attack on its own soil. The decision was obvious. Cartel had fired first, and on American territory. There would be no hesitation, no negotiation. Only one question remained: not if America would strike back, but how hard. Cartel dared to fire on U.S. soil, and Washington's retaliation was certain. The only question left? Just how powerful would that counterstrike be? By 4:35 a.m., live drone footage from Texas had already reached the Situation Room in Washington. The images were unmistakable. Armed men firing across the Rio Grande, Coast Guard vessels taking hits, Marines returning fire. There was no more doubt. This was not crime. This was armed incursion, an attack on U.S. soil. Inside the White House, President Trump sat with his Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and senior advisors. The conversation was short. Reports of heavy weapons, drones, and coordinated spotters meant the cartel force was no band of criminals. It was operating like a military unit, and that made the U.S. response inevitable. Within minutes, the order went out: bring the full weight of American firepower to the border. 15 F-35, Lightning II fighters, each worth nearly $100 million, were scrambled from Puerto Rico. Stealthy F-22 Raptors were redirected from Langley, their bomb bays loaded with 2,000-pound JDAMs. Out at sea, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers shifted into launch positions, their vertical cells packed with more than 180 Tomahawk and SM-6 missiles. On the ground, a Marine battalion of over 1,200 troops was moved into full combat readiness, supported by armored vehicles and artillery. Above them, AWACS surveillance aircraft orbited, sweeping the entire border for hidden threats. America's most advanced intelligence and strike assets were now converging on a single theater, the Rio Grande. But Washington was not relying on firepower alone. Alongside the military order came a policy directive. New deportation flights would push migrants deep into Mexico instead of releasing them back at border crossings. The cartel's business model, built on smuggling fees and quick returns, was being dismantled piece by piece. The strategy was double-edged: crush them militarily at the river and strangle their profits behind the scenes. The message was clear: This was not just punishment. It was deterrence. America would not allow armed groups, no matter how well equipped, to carve out sanctuaries at its borders. Washington had lit the green light for both a storm of firepower and a strike at the cartel's finances. But the question remained, would the cartel have even a moment to launch a counterblow before being swept aside? The order from Washington did not travel slowly through layers of bureaucracy. It snapped into action. By 4:45 a.m., the border was already shaking with the sound of engines. Across the night sky, F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightnings cut through the darkness like silent predators. They flew at supersonic speed, higher than the eye could see, but every radar operator knew they were there. Their advanced AESA radars, the kind that could map an entire battlefield in seconds, swept the riverbanks and marked each heat signature: men, vehicles, even the exhaust from hidden generators. On the Gulf of Mexico, far from the river, 2 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers turned broadside. To the untrained eye, they looked like silent gray towers on the water, but inside their vertical launch cells, hatches clanged open, revealing one of the most feared weapons in the U.S. arsenal: Tomahawk cruise missiles. At launch, the night exploded in light. The missiles shot upward, then leveled off, flying low and fast. Each carried a 1,000-pound warhead and the range to strike a target more than 1,000 miles away. Tonight, their destinations were cartel bunkers, supply camps, and command hubs. On land, Marines prepared for the strike. They crouched behind sandbags, checking ammo belts and racking rifles. The earth vibrated beneath their boots as the first jets passed overhead. Armored Humvees shifted into gear, headlights dark, waiting for the command to advance. High above them, MQ-9 Reaper drones prowled slowly, circling like vultures. From control rooms hundreds of miles away, their pilots guided them with steady hands, targeting crosshairs onto cartel boats still drifting in the current. One pilot pressed the trigger. A Hellfire missile dropped from the drone's wing, its engine igniting instantly. In less than 20 seconds, it tore into the target, blowing the vessel apart in a fireball that sprayed fragments back into the Rio Grande. This was not warning fire. This was not negotiation. This was the opening move of a counterattack designed to erase the cartel presence entirely. The first American strikes landed with terrifying precision. A JDAM, a smart bomb weighing nearly 1 ton, plunged from the bay of an F-22. It pierced straight through the roof of a cartel warehouse before detonating inside. The blast tore the structure apart from within, as if the building had been ripped open by an invisible fist. A fireball rose skyward, followed by a shockwave that rattled windows a mile away. More JDAMs followed in rapid succession. One cratered a dirt bunker, where cartel gunners had set up heavy machine guns. Another slammed into a camouflaged supply pit, igniting boxes of ammunition and turning them into a chain of secondary explosions. To Marines watching from their positions, the ground shook violently, dust and grit pelting their helmets. It felt as though the riverbank itself was erupting. From the Gulf, the destroyers spoke next. Their 5-inch deck guns, each shell the size of a man's arm, pounded cartel positions across the border. Every round whistled overhead like a freight train before smashing into the earth. Trenches collapsed, vehicles were flipped on their sides, and the makeshift barricades cartels had thrown up were reduced to rubble. To the fighters on the ground, it must have felt like the sky itself was coming down. High above, Reaper drones continued their hunt. One locked onto a cluster of muzzle flashes firing from the rooftop of a half-ruined factory. The order was confirmed, and a Hellfire missile detached, streaking downward at near supersonic speed. The rooftop erupted in flame, the cannon that had been spitting tracers silenced in an instant. Minutes later, a Marine spotter on the levee shouted coordinates into his radio. A Viper helicopter swooped in, banking sharply and unleashing a stream of 20mm shells. The rounds chewed through sandbag nests and tore apart enemy emplacements with ruthless efficiency. The effect on morale was immediate. American infantry pressed forward behind the curtain of fire, their advance covered by jets, destroyers, and drones working in unison. To those moving under the storm, every blast felt like a shield, a promise that no matter what the cartel fired back, the weight of American firepower would always be greater. The Rio Grande was no longer a river border. It had become a front line drowned in thunder and flame. Even under the crushing storm of bombs and missiles, the cartel refused to vanish quietly. Fighters scrambled into hidden positions, emerging from tunnels and half-collapsed buildings to fire back. From the tree line, a sharp flash announced the launch of a shoulder-fired missile. The projectile cut across the sky in a streak of fire, locking onto the heat signature of an American drone. Within seconds, a Reaper spiraled down, trailing smoke before smashing into the ground with a fireball. Nearby, cartel gunners manned a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun mounted on the back of a battered truck. The twin barrels rattled furiously, sending streams of red tracers upward. The weapon shook the entire vehicle, its tires bouncing with the recoil. The aim was wild, but the volume of fire was enough to force American jets to climb higher. One F-15EX passing through the barrage took shrapnel along its wing, alarms shrieking inside the cockpit. The pilot pulled hard, nursing the damaged jet out of range before heading back to base. On the ground, the cartel revealed more tricks. Small quadcopter drones, each carrying improvised explosives, buzzed low over Marine lines. One slammed into a sandbag nest, its blast scattering dirt and injuring 2 Marines. Another dove at a Humvee, detonating on impact and blowing out its tires. Smoke and dust filled the air, Marines dragging their wounded comrades back while covering each other with bursts of rifle fire. The cartel also used smoke grenades and burning tires, trying to mask their movements from the relentless eyes of American drones. Some fighters even blasted messages through loudspeakers, shouting taunts in Spanish across the river, a crude attempt to rattle the advancing Marines. Despite the chaos, American medics moved quickly. Under covering fire, they treated the wounded, stabilizing injuries before evacuating them by armored vehicle. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights cutting through smoke as they scanned for more threats. The cartel's defiance made one fact clear. This was not a ragged gang of smugglers. They fought in squads, shifted positions with hand signals, and launched coordinated bursts of fire. They had trained, prepared, and come with the intent to stand their ground. Outgunned and outnumbered, yes, but determined to fight like soldiers against the mightiest military in the world. By 5:05 a.m., the balance of the battle tipped completely. The cartel's resistance had slowed the American advance, but the hammer blow was still to come. High above the smoke, 2 F-22 Raptors banked hard and dove steeply toward their targets. One released a JDAM, its guidance fins snapping open as it fell. The bomb punched through the roof of the cartel's field headquarters, a cluster of prefabricated huts reinforced with sandbags and steel plates. For half a second there was silence, then the explosion tore upward from inside, blowing the entire command post apart. Radios, maps, and fighters vanished in a roar of flame. The cartel's central nervous system had just been cut. At the same time, another wave of Tomahawks screamed in from the Gulf. Flying only a few hundred feet above the ground, they slammed into a fuel depot hidden near the river. The result was cataclysmic. Drums of gasoline and diesel erupted one after another, a chain of blasts that rolled down the shoreline. A wall of fire surged skyward, illuminating the battlefield as if the sun had risen in an instant. The shockwave hit like a physical blow, shaking the helmets of Marines and knocking men flat on both sides of the river. The Marines seized the opportunity. Under the cover of the bombardment, platoons surged forward, clearing trenches and storming bunkers. Grenades popped in rapid succession as squads flushed out the last defenders. One team deployed smoke grenades to mask their advance, while another used flamethrowers to burn cartel fighters out of makeshift tunnels. Step by step, the levee was retaken. At 5:15, a Stars and Stripes was raised over the captured bank. American cameras recorded the moment, broadcasting live to command centers. For the first time that night, the front line no longer belonged to the cartel. It was firmly, visibly, undeniably American ground. The cartel's gamble to land in Texas had ended not with glory, but with fire and ruin. What had begun as an act of defiance was crushed under a storm of steel. The battlefield itself bore the scars, craters glowing with flame, wrecked vehicles smoking in the dawn air, and the shattered remnants of a force that had dared to challenge the United States on its own soil. The fires still raged along the Rio Grande as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Columns of smoke twisted skyward, glowing red in the sunrise. The battlefield was littered with shattered weapons, burned-out boats, and trenches reduced to rubble. U.S. Marines stood guard on the captured bank, rifles ready, their silhouettes framed by the rising sun. In less than an hour, the cartel's force had been broken, their command destroyed, their infrastructure burning. For America, this was not just victory, it was a statement. The world had just watched what happened when armed men tried to plant their flag on U.S. soil. After being crushed under such a storm of fire and steel, could any force on Earth still dare to test America's military power on its own territory? By 5:30 a.m., the battle was over. The last bursts of gunfire along the Rio Grande faded into silence. U.S. Marines moved carefully through smoldering trenches and shattered bunkers, collecting weapons and rounding up survivors. More than 60 cartel fighters dropped their rifles and surrendered, hands raised. The rest were dead, wounded, or scattered. The numbers told the story. America had lost 2 drones and 1 fighter jet forced into emergency landing, with several Marines lightly wounded. But the cartel paid a staggering price. More than 200 killed, 40 armed boats destroyed, and nearly $3.5 billion worth of infrastructure reduced to rubble. What had begun as a bold landing force ended as nothing but twisted metal and burning wreckage. The consequences were immediate. Intelligence showed cartel commanders abandoning open bases and going into hiding. Smuggling networks once operating openly were now fractured. Arrest statistics proved the shift, from 56,000 captures in July 2024 down to just 4,600 by July 2025. The cartels were no longer confident. They were bleeding money, forced into secrecy, crushed by the dual pressure of American firepower and economic strangulation. For Washington, this was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic message. To allies, it showed that the United States would defend its soil with overwhelming strength. To enemies, it was a warning. Even the most daring incursion would be answered not with hesitation, but with destruction. On the riverbank, the American flag waved in the dawn breeze. The message could not have been clearer. This was not just a battle. It was a reminder to the entire world. Step onto U.S. territory, and the response will be total annihilation. The battle in Texas proved one clear point. When American military power is unleashed, no enemy can stand against it. This is a message to the world, defending the homeland, protecting the people, and preserving national honor. If you want to keep exploring hidden military stories, intense battles, and secret technologies rarely revealed, make sure to like and subscribe to Military Power. Your support is what drives us to bring you even more unique analysis and stories.